Now, this evening, I take great pleasure in welcoming Dr. Oliver Moore, who is Saving Scotland's Rainforest Lichen and Bryophytes Advisor for Plantlife. Plantlife are the international conservation membership charity who work to secure a world rich in plants, wild plants, and fungi. Tonight, Oliver is going to talk to us about the lichens and bryophytes of Scotland's rainforest. So, over to you now. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thanks, Jacqueline. Well, thanks so much for sparing your time this evening. Special. This is a slight change to the title, but rest assured, it's all about the bryophytes and lichens as advertised. Um, so, temperate rainforest habitat, what does it look like? Well, it looks like any other kind of woodland you might get across. Sort of, I'm looking at a stand of hazel mixed with a bit of birch in here. Some bits of the temperate rainforest habitat might be birch woods or oak woods, even Scots pine woods in the west coast. But whilst they may contain trees that can occur all over the British Isles, what makes them special are very much the bryophytes and lichens. Some of these have a very restricted distribution. Um, so just to give you a little bit of context, um, this is the global distribution of temperate rainforest habitat. But generally, the main take-home message is that this is an extremely rare habitat globally. And what we're seeing here is the zones in which the right climatic conditions exist for temperate rainforest habitat to occur. And what we're looking at is mild winters, cool summers, and a frequency of rainfall throughout the whole of the year. So in the summertime as well. And those of you who live in the Argyll area will know all about those sort of wet days, like what I've got here today, but in the summertime as well. Um, what does this look like in terms of um, the Scotland's rainforest zone? Well, I should say that this shaded area here is the Saving Scotland's Rainforest project area. And I completely acknowledge that there are stands of temperate rainforest habitat outside of this zone as well in parts of Scotland, usually as a result of sort of local geographic features like steep north slopes, um, uh, proximity to rivers and things, lochs and what have you, which generate the same sort of humid conditions. But generally, what we're seeing here in this map is where the hyperoceanic or that sort of rainforest climate envelope occurs. Within this, represents about 20% of Scotland's land area, sadly, only 30,000, well, only about 30,000 hectares of good condition temperate rainforest actually remains. But so as Jacqueline mentioned, Plantlife are very much looking to restore, protect, and expand the rainforest habitat. But we do this in partnership with over 20 different partner organisations within the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforest. And this is the area that alliance have decided to focus their efforts. But it's not just, it's not just the climate that's important for getting good quality rainforest habitat or having good quality rainforest habitat. It's also about the ecological continuity of woodlands. What I mean by that is woodlands the longer that a piece of ground has been woodland going back centuries, the more likely you're going to have some really special species in there. We'll talk a little bit more about ecological continuity in a little while. The picture that you're looking at last, we've got a picture of something. This is a type of lichen. Some of you will know it very well, others less so. This is something called tree lungwort. And in certain parts of the United Kingdom, it very much is an indicator of rainforest. In Scotland, it's actually not necessarily an indicator species of rainforest habitat, but it does generally um, mean that you've got sort of old growth woodland um, in places. Um, so what I mean by that is that there's been, again, we're coming back to that term continuity. So as one, you've got a mature tree with this stuff, this lichen on it, and then um, as other trees around it grow, this is able to colonize as the bark becomes suitable, and this continues. If there's ever a break in that sort of conveyor belt, if you like, of woodland, um, then you start losing species such as this. Um, so, but the thing is, with tree lungwort, much more widespread in British Isles. Now, I hail from North Norfolk, and I was very surprised that even in the past, tree lungwort was known from North Norfolk. Not very much of it. It's a very dry county, but um, this species did also used to occur across much of continental Europe as well. Um, so it's not. So that's what I mean by it not being a rainforest species as such. But what's happened in those places elsewhere in the British Isles and across Europe, there's been um, as a result of air pollution and also as a result of extractive timber industries, we've started to lose. This species has declined massively. What's fantastic is that the temperate rainforest of Scotland is still a stronghold for this species. But maybe there's a link there with there being perhaps more old growth woodland in these places, but also the ecological conditions are very, very favourable for the growth of this particular lichen. I'm just going to go to the next slide, and then we'll start thinking about what a lichen is. Now, this species is a bit of a mouthful. Look at that. Pseudocyphalaria intricata. It's a type of specklebelly. Now, this species is also an entity of woodland habitat in one place. And but the difference here is that this is very much a hyper-oceanic species. In other words, it's a species of old growth woodland that very much favours those cool summers, warm winters, and mild winters, and the frequency of rainfall. Now you'll notice that the previous lichen was quite bright green, and this particular lichen here is quite brownish grey. Now we need to talk about what is a lichen. So a lichen is a composite organism. What does that mean? It's made up of more than one individual species. I suppose it's often described as a lichen symbiosis, and you've got two or more species living closely together. So that might be a parasitism. For example, you might have had ringworm or athlete's foot over the course of your lives. That's an example of symbiosis, but that's a parasitism. The fungus is living on you. You're not getting much benefit from that. In the lichen symbiosis, it's sometimes described as mutualistic in the sense that fungi are not able to photosynthesize. They cannot convert the sun's light energy into sugars. So it's actually beneficial for the fungi if they could somehow, the fungi involved in a lichen symbiosis, could somehow grow closely together with an organism that can photosynthesize. So the fungal partner is known as the mycobiont. Mycology is the study of fungi. Guessing it's Greek for fungi. So the fungus is the mycobiont, and it is in a symbiosis with a photobiont, which is usually an algae, or it's sometimes a cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green algae, confusingly. Now, the previous lichen we saw, I'm just going to go back. The previous lichen here, the tree lungwort, the main photobiont is a green algae, and it goes a lovely green color when it's wet. Whereas in the other species, it's and they tend to be often blues and greys. In this case, brown, but it goes. You can see it's gone a bit bluey towards the right of the image there. Both organisms, both groups, the algae and the cyanobacteria, are able to photosynthesize and provide the fungus with the sugar. But it needs. You might be thinking, but what's the benefit to the photobiont here? I can see how the fungus is benefiting. Well, by being in a lichen symbiosis, I suppose you can argue that the photobiont is able to live in a lot more places than it would otherwise be able to survive. For example, you'll find it on trees, you'll find lichens on rocks, you'll find lichens on buildings. I've seen lichens on cars and on other sort of metal objects. It's always fascinating, but without being in a lichen symbiosis, you're probably not going to find algae in some of these slightly more exposed places. Okay, I'm going to move to the next slide. Ooh, now this is another type of Pseudocyphaloria. Again, it's a good indicator of temperate rainforest habitat. It's called the yellow specklebelly, and I think it's a bit more obvious why it's called a specklebelly here. It's covered in these breaks in the thallus structure, and that sort of revealing the fungal material below, mixed in with a bit of algal material, and sometimes when an animal brushes against this, or say if I've got my hand ends pressed against this and I go and move to another tree, I'll carry some of this sort of powdery stuff with me, either on my nose or on my arm or something, or a bird might have it on their feet. And what you've got there in those sort of yellow, bright yellow sort of bits of powdery material is a mixture of the fungus and the photobiont, and it's able to potentially, there's a way of spreading in an asexual way. Now, I should also say, I've given you a very simplistic definition of a lichen so far. It's a microbiont, the fungal partner, a photobiont, the algal or the cyanobacterial partner. But some species, like the tree lungwort at the beginning, also have, they've got the algae as the main component, but they also have cyanobacteria in them as well. Not only that, but even as recently as 2016, scientists started confirming that actually all along there's hidden components within the lichen symbiosis. They've found up to 2 or 3 yeast species, for instance, within the lichens, which people had just not seen before. There's bacteria. Sometimes there's Lichenicolous fungi, that fungi which parasitizes the lichen thallus. And so when you're looking at a lichen, it's a composite organism of so many different sort of species and taxonomic groups, really. And I've loved the best description of a lichen, or best analogy of a lichen I've ever come across, is thinking of a lichen as the song, as resulting from the efforts of a group of musicians. So a lichen is so much more than the sum of its parts. What we're seeing, this beautiful thallus structure is like the song composed by a group of musicians. So lichens come in all sorts of shapes and forms, and for those of you interested in evolution, they haven't stemmed from from a single origin. The lichen symbiosis has been a very useful way of surviving and growing and existing in the world, that it's evolved in different sort of fungal groups. This particular lichen is a type of jelly lichen. This is called Leptogium burgessii, but actually it's got quite a funky vernacular name as the frilly fruited jelly skin. So what we're seeing there, those sort of reddish discs, they're like the reproductive structures of the lichen. Because a lot of lichens belong to a group of fungi called the Ascomycetina or Ascomycetes, which are cut for lichens' reproductive structures, often look like discs, like we're seeing in the image here. Now, if I was to cut, if I was to take that disc and cut it down the middle, and then maybe take another thinner slice across the section, basically, it'd be like cutting into a jam tart. I'll have a pastry base with a nice jam contents, but that jam contents of the lichen disc is actually made up of, well, I can't quite see it that clearly in here, but it's made up of um, like lots of like finger-like structures, and then amongst the finger-like structures, there's like these sort of baggy balloons, and in the baggy balloons, you have like these things called ascospores. And what we can see in this picture is not a picture of like an alien planet with life coming to coming from Mars or whatever. What we're seeing is, if I just put the cursor on it, these little structures here, these are like the spores of the lichen. It's only the fungal partner of the lichen that's able to reproduce. And perhaps one of the costs for the photobiont in a lichen symbiosis is that it's not able to reproduce sexually. But it does, there's clearly benefits to being involved in this symbiosis. This particular, this is a times 400 magnification picture down a microscope, and it's actually showing something called Porpidia hydrophila. And what's interesting about that, it's got this beautiful, well, to my eyes anyway, this beautiful sort of grey blue sort of epithecium when you look at it down a microscope. Sometimes you can even see it by, you know, it's a way of identifying it in the field that the blue sometimes is apparent down at hand ends. Okay, so here's another lichen with those lovely reproductive structures. Again, you've got the discs there. When I came across this in the Fort William area, the local people there were referred to something called dragon skin, and I just guessed what lichen they were talking about, and ever since then I've been calling this lichen dragon skin. It's wonderful because it's beautiful sort of lurid green when it's wet, and yet when it's dry, you could almost walk past it because it goes sort of creamy, pale and creamy. But the moment you add some water to it, it instantly transforms into this beautiful sort of green, wrinkled, ad-pressed lichen. Incidentally, this is another species that's more indicative of old growth woodland rather than a rainforest indicator. It's more of a thermophilous species, so you don't tend to find it in places which have lots of frosts, things like that. So it's quite common within Scotland's rainforest because of the milder winters there. Now, I've included this picture because I was thrilled to encounter this species for myself. I'd only sort of read about it previously. I happened to be walking up a little lane in Assynt, and as I was going past what I called a rainforest ditch, it was just brilliant. The woodland was coming down to the roadside. There was then a bit of a steep bank to the road, and that was dripping. It was full of all sorts of wonderful things. And I just happened to notice that something like a free living blue-green algae was growing over some various bryophytes. But on closer inspection, I noticed that underneath this organism, there were these lovely chalky white structures. And I realized that I confirmed it later, but this is I think this is the only representative of a lichen in the British Isles that actually is the microbiont is actually a bracket fungus. And so the reproductive structures in this particular lichen are actually like miniature brackets, which I'm just putting the cursor on the screen here. And there's also some fungi. I haven't got a picture in this sequence of slides, but there are some fungi which are the fungus partner is actually related to the sort of the mushrooms you'd buy in the supermarket. And when they produce fruiting bodies, you've guessed it, they produce miniature mushrooms. Or I should have said, sorry, this species is Dictyonema carpinsii. Now, this species um, is another uh, is a good rainforest species. Um, it doesn't have the best powers of dispersal, but where it occurs, you sometimes get quite a lot of it. It's so, for instance, there's a stand in the foreground here. There's a patch in the on the background, and then there's another smaller patch further along. Sometimes you see it on oak trees as well, lovely old oaks, and it looks like it's sort of tumbling down the trunk, and it's sometimes called the tumbling kittens, also known as the tailed loop lichen, because it forms these wonderful towards the sort of edges of the lobes or the some of the ends of the lobes tend to sort of roll inwards and they form like these almost like semi-tube like structures. So that's quite a distinctive feature for this particular lichen. Okay, coming back to talking about ecological continuity now. So here's a stand of hazelwood, which isn't too far away from me. So outside of the Saving Scotland's Rainforest project area, but still very much an example of temperate rainforest habitat. It's humid because it's on a north-facing slope. It's got a wet wooden floor, and we're quite close to a sizable river. But the important feature here is that just by me recording the number of species and seeing what sort of species I was finding in this woodland, I know that these woods have not been coppiced either ever or at least not for centuries. So we're seeing multi-stemmed hazel, which is its natural growth form. But it's at each stand of hazel, each sort of stool of hazel with all these different stems, absolutely plastered in all sorts of wonderful lichens. I was recording around about 40 or so species on each of the hazel. And yet, I know it hasn't been coppiced because if we were to coppice this, we would lose all that biodiversity in one fell swoop. And anecdotal evidence from elsewhere where coppicing has been done, say 50-year lichen records, and now they're looking at what lichens have come back after 50 years of it having been coppiced, and it's hardly any very it's nowhere near what it was like. So it just goes to show how important ecological continuity is, and how important it is that woodlands are not sort of experience a drastic sort of shift in or drastic ecological disturbance. So the next picture shows a close-up of Loborina scribiculata, which is the textured lungwort. And this particular species, the main photobiont belongs is a type of cyanobacteria. So when it goes wet, it goes from a sort of a very pale lime milkshake color to this extraordinary blue-gray color. Really very attractive species. Now on birch trees, some of the old birch trees in sort of in our temperate rainforests, you sometimes come across this lichen. This is a type of crustose lichen. So some of the ones I've been showing you before are sort of, yes, it's all a phallus, but some of them are quite leafy. They're called folios. The surface of the substrate. I've included it here because it was Valentine's Day yesterday, and this particular species has a nice vernacular name. It's called the bleeding heart lichen because when its reproductive structures, when they sort of fall off for whatever reason, or if they're grazed by a slug or something, they've left this lovely sort of red, carmine red sort of coloration at the base of the reproductive structures known as apothecia. Now, this epitomizes the study of lichenology because up until fairly recently, it was only thought to be one species, Mycoblastus sanguinarius. I took this photo about 10 years ago or so. But now we've worked out that, or lichenologist scientists have worked out that actually there's two species involved, and you can only really separate them with confidence by looking at a section of the reproductive structure using polarized light. And there's now a species which seems to be turning up, seems to be more associated with the temperate rainforest, and that's now known as Mycoblastus sanguinarioides. But unless you look down the microscope at a candidate specimen, you can't confirm properly. I say it epitomizes lineage, and I just love the fact that the British Lichen Society logo. So let's think about the RSPB has an avocet, has their logo. I think the Wildlife Trust have a badger. The British Lichen Society have a type of Cladonia lichen, which used to be known as Cladonia crucifera, but even that has now been split into about 6 different species. So the study of lichenology, there's always lots to learn, lots to challenge you. Now, some of these species, when I'm out doing my job, when I'm setting up baseline monitoring plots, for instance, they're sort of very valuable to use. So you've got that's why there's like a little marker in place here, and I've taken grid references and measured it. We can use these to sort of assess how well the habitat is doing over the years, and making sure that management is going in the right direction. Now, this species is known as Menegasia tuberata, another mouthful. I've put all these with like some names that they can follow up later on. But this has also got a lovely vernacular name. If you look very carefully at this lichen or in this photo, you might just be able to make out some little like perfect little circles towards the ends of the thallus. So just before the thallus lobe split up at the end, you might just be able to make out some little circles. And so it looks like a lichen version of a musical instrument. I know this is slightly tenuous, but it's called the tree flute, if you'd rather have a different name than Menegasia tuberata. And this is where it was growing. It was growing sort of towards the base of relatively young birch trees, although they're sort of might be older than they actually look, these trees. But uh, so I set up a baseline monitoring plot here, just to see what happens. And on one of these trees, there were several different sort of rainforest indicator species just on one tree alone. And just before I finish talking about lichens, because I like to talk about bryophytes as well, just to finish off, we've got that Loborina scorbiculator on the left here, and on the right, we've got something called Ocholoechia tartaria, which is also known as the cudbear lichen. And this was a very important lichen back in the 19th century, I think, because or it might have been the 18th century, because it produced a purple dye, and purple was a very rare color, probably why it's the color of royalty. Very rare dye it was, using in a synthetic manner. So I suppose in some ways that has stopped over exploiting this particular lichen. But back then, there were fewer humans on the planet, so there would have been less of an impact. Now, before I move on, if I wasn't interested in lichens from a scientific point of view, I would just definitely want to be painting. Just absolutely look at all the different textures and colours in that lovely Loborina scorbiculator. Okay. Right, so we'll talk about bryophytes now. And when you get boulders in woodland, in the rainforest zone, often with like these brown cushions, of liverworts, that's generally a good sign that during temperate rainforest habitat, these are made up of liverworts. We've got mosses there as well. Sometimes you get Wilson's filmy fern growing amongst these diverse cushions of bryophytes. That's the so Wilson's filmy fern is scattered throughout here. It's a slightly darker green amongst all these browns and reds and greens and yellows. So these are often a feature boulders with these sort of beautiful sort of oceanic bryophyte cushions. But before I continue, I want to describe what is a bryophyte. So bryophytes are in the plant kingdom. They're types of plants. They're different to one of the differences they have with plants that we're more familiar with is that bryophytes, they don't possess roots as such. They're able to take their water and nutrients across their whole body, across the whole plant, which only really the filmy ferns are able to do out of the other sort of bigger plants. The word bryophyte, I think, comes from the Greek, which means to rapidly hydrate. And that also, this is something you can try if you find some dry moss on a garden wall or something. If you add some water to it, you can just sort of watch it in real time in seconds. Just to absorb the water, expands, and it's becoming photosynthetically active as you watch. Now, bryophytes are made up of liverworts and mosses and hornworts. I'm going to focus on liverworts and mosses. We only have 4 hornwort species in Britain, and I don't really encounter them that much. Well, I don't think I've ever seen them in a temperate rainforest habitat. More sort of arable fields is their habitat and forestry tracts. Now, liverworts can be split up into those liverworts that are called thalloid liverworts, and they pretty much look like lichens, but they're very, very green and able to photosynthesize all by themselves. Here's an example. This is something called Lunularia cruciata. Don't know about the vernacular. It's probably like something like crescent cup liverwort or something like that. The Lunularia is referring to like these little half moon structures. And if you look at this one here towards the left, you can see like these little green eggs, if you like. They're not really eggs as such, but they're asexual reproductive structures called gemmy. And so when rain hits these little crescent cups, these little balls of gemmy spring out, and then they can start forming a new thallus. So like a way of asexual reproduction. We also have leafy liverworts, and this possibly isn't the best picture, but you might be able to see lots of this is in the dry state. So there's been a little bit of dry weather, and so it's all become very much enrolled. If this was to be wetted, it transforms itself. The 1970s Doctor Who stories, I can, and I remember creatures called the Cybermen, and they sometimes have these creatures called Cybermats. And I don't know what it is about this liverwort, but there's something about it that just makes me think of the Cybermats from Doctor Who back in the day. But perhaps more usefully, this is a great liverwort to find if you haven't got any black pepper and you're wild camping or something. It's called the what's it called? Bitter scalewort, I think it's called. Oh, Perella arboris vitae. And if you were to nibble the tips of these shoots, yeah, it gives you a real good peppery kick. And we also have mosses. Now, there are ways to distinguish between mosses and liverworts. It's a whole lecture in itself. In the field, I suppose you sort of look at how the leaves are arranged, and in liverworts, the leaves are often in sort of in ranks of 2, whereas in mosses, they're not necessarily in ranks of 2, although there are exceptions to the rule, as there always are in these sort of things. So what we've got here, we've got a couple of sort of nice oceanic species. We've got something called Hyacombium omocum. That's a very nice rainforest species to find. I think that's something called the green bow moss or Dichronodontium subparadictium. And this photo was taken from Ben A in Westeros. Um, Now, mosses mosses are able to also reproduce by or produce spores as a result of sexual reproduction. And my cursor, I'm just my cursor is just going over some of these little reproductive structures. These are called sporophytes, and they're made up of a seta and a capsule. And from those capsules, spores are released. Um, this particular species, this is something called Daltonia splachnoides or Irish Daltonia. So it very much likes rainforest conditions, but it likes even wetter situations, really. This was found on a piece of on a stem of willow growing very close to the splash zone of a cascading sort of waterfall. So it likes that extra bit of moisture. And here's an example that sort of shows this is a leafy liverwort or western featherwort, and you can see the sort of two ranks of leaves, so sort of like the leaves sort of opposite each other as they go down the stem. Other features of liverwort leaves is that they tend to have sort of lobed leaves. These are quite spiny lobes in this particular example. If we're finding some of these organisms in a piece of woodland, then again it's a good indicator of ecological continuity as much as hyperoceanic conditions. So I've mentioned the word hyperoceanic conditions there, as if living in Argyll isn't wet enough. Some of these species, some of our sort of most exacting hyperoceanic liverworts need to be in the still need to be in the sort of the dankest, deepest ravines or in the spray zone of waterfalls in order to survive in the temperate rainforest habitat. The hyperoceanic conditions, they're very intolerant of drought. And we're talking very tiny little species here. So the three little pointers are pointing to three different stands of a tiny little liverwort on a rock in a little burn at the bottom of a ravine. And there's no point me trying to take a photo of that in situ. So the next slide shows you a picture of what it looks like down a microscope. Incidentally, check out the scientific name, Cotyledonia microscopica. That says it all, really. The picture on the right in the circle that's looking down a microscope, that's actually times 100. I'm not sure. I've sort of expanded the picture on the left. The absurd vernacular name for this species is long-leaved pouncewort. And I just love the fact that the word long is associated with this tiny little organism. But I guess the leaves are slightly longer than wide. They look like little limes, and it does help you separate it from similar species. And here's an example where I've been using a very uncommon rare rainforest moss in my monitoring plots. The species here is something called Hageniella micans, or the sparkling signal moss. And you might just be able to make out that it actually is occurring on a rock that's embedded in the woodland floor. It's the slope of the woodland is such that water will periodically run over that rock, but it's kept clear by occasional disturbance by deer passage. Very important. And here's a slightly closer up version. So we're talking very tiny, narrow shoots, but then it looks like somebody's come along with a fine comb and just sort of combed them over, and they've got this lovely sort of golden color. So I think sparkling signal moss is a great name for this wonderful little species. And if you were to find this in your local woods, then that justifies it being a notifiable site just on its own. Now I had, as I joined the meeting, I had people talking about glue fungus in their woods. So you are blessed. It's always wonderful to find glue fungus. For those that are not familiar with this species, so here's a stand of hazel. This random stick just hanging in the air, and that's somehow fastened to another stick. And so the bottom photograph is showing a close-up of that, how it's fastened. And what's happened is um, in this in the dead sort of stems or in the dead twigs when they're aloft, there's a fungus called Hymenocete corrugata, or type of glue fungus, um, and so that's already infected or has got into the dead wood. It's not harming the tree as such. The woods, you get these dead stems, the fungus colonizes, and then it starts breaking down the dead wood. But it's important that it doesn't. If that twig was to have fallen to the ground, then other species would start breaking it down. So the glue fungus is sort of getting ahead of the game, keeping it supported above the ground where it can sort of break it down to its heart's content. And so what tends to happen is bits of wood get snapped off in storms and things. They get snagged in the stems above. And then whilst those stems are snagged, the glue fungus then fastens itself to other bits of the hazel. And I mean, what's happened here is that, a bit's just sort of fallen off and then suspended this bit of twig. But what I love about this modus operandi is that it's very similar to how some fungi operate in tropical rainforests. I've never experienced tropical rainforest, but I remember studying them and remember hearing how there's like below the canopy, there's like a mesh of mycorrhizal or fungal material which captures the sort of broken twigs and other debris before it gets to the woodland floor, so it can then access the nutrients that way. So it's something similar, and I like that sort of link with our temperate rainforests. The other good news is that if you've got glue fungus in your woodland, you need to look out for this species. This is something that has been shown to be a parasite of the glue fungus, and this is the reproductive structure. It looks so unusual. I've seen wonderful photos of this on the internet. This is something called hazel gloves fungus or Hippocreopsis rhododendri. There's a dead patch of it there. Sometimes that's what you might see sort of later in the season. But now's the time to be looking for it. It sort of starts appearing sort of mid-October all the way through March. I think I took this photo in early April one year. And again, associated with sort of some pretty nice ancient stands of hazel. So definitely a useful indicator of temperate rainforest habitat. If you see this in your woods, then the chances are you've got some pretty nice lichens and bryophytes as well. Okay, so coming towards the end of my talk, just like to go over some of the threats that our temperate rainforests face. So enemy number one, rhododendron ponticum, and along with a number of other sort of invasive non-native species. But this is so devastating in its effects. It's evergreen foliage, it's dense growth, it just smothers the ground, blocks out the light, it smothers tree bark, and all of the wonderful species that I've just been showing you very rapidly disappear under this sort of shade. So a huge problem, and one that the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforests are very much trying to tackle, but at a landscape scale. And so that's whole, so in a sort of way that you can defend an area. So looking at peninsulas and trying to get rid of all the rhododendron on a particular peninsula, because otherwise it will just keep coming back. And then monitoring is important as well to to try and, uh, as you go into a maintenance phase, to sort of pull up any young seedlings from coming in from elsewhere. Another threat to our rainforest has been the decades of heavy browsing pressure from deer and livestock. Here's an example of what sort of happens. This is a birch wood, but as you can see, it's very open. You've got grass, you've got old trees, and you can see in the sort of background, you've got some like dead old trees that have died, snapped in the wind, or what have you. They're important habitats by themselves, but ultimately, this woodland is doomed. It's called a moribund woodland in that there's nothing to replace die because all these seedlings and saplings just get eaten year on year. Here's another example where you've had a long period of browsing pressure. This is sheep have access to this particular woodland. And what's interesting here is that under that continued pressure, hazel doesn't have its natural multi-stemmed form. So you've got like single-stemmed hazel trees growing here. But actually, if you look towards the base, you can see where some of the basal growth has just been nibbled off. And this sort of carries on year, so you just end up with single-stem hazel trees. Ultimately, this would be doomed as well. However, what sometimes happens is that a fence is erected, a deer fence in this case, to keep the herbivore out. So you've had a long period of grazing pressure over the years, decades, and then you have no grazing whatsoever. And you then get this marvelous regeneration. Look at it. But there's a risk because if you've got some of these lovely old mature trees, then you have the same effect as what the rhododendron's having, because all this dense regeneration can shade out the very species that makes temperate rainforest habitat special. And so it's great to hear that there's a gradual move towards trying to get deer numbers down, for instance, in Scotland's rainforest, sort of by by culling, increasing culls rather than having complete exclusion, so that eventually over the years the deer numbers might get low enough to enable palatable tree species to come back along with the rest of the temperate rainforest ecosystem. That's still a little way to come, but hopefully there's a move towards that approach rather than putting up these exclosures. There are other threats, of course. I mentioned the fact that Scotland's rainforest only had 30,000 hectares of good habitat remaining, and that's a lot of that is fragmented, and so it's another objective of the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforest is to try and expand and connect those fragments. Anyway, I hope I've given you a little bit of a glimpse of some of these wonderful treasures we have in our temperate rainforest habitat, the bryophytes and lichens. If you want to find out more about mosses and liverworts and hornworts, then do have a look at the British Biological website. If you want to find out more about lichens, do the same with their website. And then if you want to have a look at any of the sort of those links. I'd just like to finish with that last photo there, which shows that, yeah, one thing I have learned about working in Scotland's temperate rainforest is that I don't half get a proper soaking on a regular basis. That's me on the right there, and I was absolutely soaked to the skin. Anyway, thanks very much, and I think I'll try and address some of your questions now.
Thank you very much, Oliver. I love that photo as well. It's really good. That sums up some of my days in the woods at Taynish with large groups of children in the past. So but anyway, lots of amazing photos as well. All those photos were by yourself, Oliver, yes?
Most of them were. There was two or three that weren't. Yeah, which I've put all the credits in there.
One thing I was going to ask you about, Oliver, was my father-in-law used to live on Mull, and during the war, he actually collected, they used to, um, part of the war effort was to collect the sphagnum moss for wound dressing. Does it ever get used for that still today, or is that just something that was in the past?
Well, it's a fantastic thing to use because sphagnum can take up to 20 times its mass in water, so very absorbent. It also contains various acids which tend to denature bacteria. So if I need to decontaminate my hands in the field, I sometimes just go and I pick a common species of sphagnum and just rub my hands with that. It's wonderful material. I was remembering, yeah, it's been used for all sorts of purposes, um, nappies, and sort of menstruation, for instance, in the past, before we had all the sort of products we have these days.
Mhm.
Um, it's a valuable substance. I often think about this when people talk of trying to sort of de-plastic their lives. You know, can we use bracken for packaging? Can we use sphagnum for some other aspects? But I guess, as with everything, you've just got to be a bit careful how much you use because you start using something on an industrial scale, it has impacts.
I visited Skye last summer, and I was in Dun vegan castle with some old trees. It was not really a rainforest, but do all trees can you compare an old woodland garden as a sort of type of rainforest?
It's a good question, Hank. Uh, I guess, it depends on so I'd look at the bryophyte lichen species present on the different trees. So you might well have rainforest species of lichens on those oak trees. It's possible, probably, and sometimes sort of certainly around like castles and what have you, they're often called like policy woodlands, sort of planted around the big houses and what have you. So it's not natural as such, but they're often a really good resource for rainforest lichens. Um, so, so I'm thinking of things well, I've seen on big estates where you have like these old sycamore trees, which aren't a rainforest species, but in this age of ash dieback disease, the sycamore bark is actually a reasonable surrogate. So having an old sycamore, I'd definitely keep around because that's going to support some important species. Um, so I guess, yeah, it's to answer your question, probably not. It's policy woodland. It's not necessarily rainforest, but it does hold rainforest bryophytes and
Well,
lichens.
yeah, it's very close to it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
I've seen this extraordinary thing in another garden in the rainforest zone. I've seen this azalea bush, so totally non-native, and it had about 34 different species of lichens and bryophytes in this one azalea bush, 14 of which were like rainforest index species. It was it was mind blowing. But so I thought to myself, well, okay, so it's not rainforest, but if ever we were to try and naturalize this and get native species back, that azalea bush could be the source of inoculum to colonize the native
Yes.
woodland I want to create. So I've got to keep that. It's just it's mind boggling, but it's yeah, there we go.
Okay. Thank you.
I've got a question from Catherine Haig as well. Catherine, did you want to ask it, or shall I ask it for you?
Hi, yes, I'm here. Yes, I'm
Thank
just
you.
interested. I mean, there was a highlighted thing popped up yesterday on my phone telling me that the Gulf Stream's turning off next year, which may or may not be true. But,
Wow.
what effect is this going to have on our temperate rainforests?
Yeah. Yeah, it could be quite interesting, that one. Um, I don't know if it's going to be as soon as that, but something to consider. I suppose the more I've been sort of more concerned about the effect of climate change and the fact that we might be moving towards longer periods of drought, even in Argyll and other sort of rainforest places, which will have implications for some of our sort of most demanding species. That's some of those little hyperoceanic liverworts and things. And so, in terms of trying to mitigate against that, it'd be very important to, when we're thinking about planting or securing woodland for future rainforest, to plant sort of close to rivers, plant close to lochs, because the sort of natural humidity of those places will hopefully counter those sort of longer dry spells, if that makes sense. But at the same time, those trees have to be allowed to reach maturity and become veterans as well in those places. So that's just one approach that we could start doing something about that now. If the Gulf Stream does completely shift, then yeah, that'd be interesting to see what happens. Yeah, I've often wondered about that because the winters are cold enough for me in the east of Scotland already.
Thanks. Yeah, as a native of Argyll, the idea of having a bit of drought is actually quite pleasant at times. But yeah, I'm hoping it's not going to change too much.
Oh, well done. Good answer.
And I've got a question from Nancy McQueen as well. Nancy, would you like to ask it? Is Nancy there? Your question is, can lichens be an indicator of climate change?
Yes, they can. Yeah, and bryophytes as well. And we're sort of seeing this through the British Light Society and British Biological Society. We have various people out recording just in their spare time. I'm a voice country recorder from Mid Perthshire, for instance, and we record elsewhere around Scotland. But over the years, you see, you can sort of look back at different sort of distribution atlases, and you can actually see a shift in things, a shift in species moving south to north, for instance, and also seeing species declining from the south. And I'm thinking, yeah, so definitely indicate changing climate. You can separate it from, sometimes you have to be careful with these atlases because often it just shows you where a lichenologist lives, and then it's like the dots all around where they live. So I know that I've got loads of dots within 10-kilometer cycle rider where I live, for instance. So there's bias there, but if you can sort of sort that out statistically, and also looking at the species, select your species, and you can see a sort of northward shift in some of these things.
Hi. Yeah, so I mean, I'm not a professional bryologist or anything, but just an observer and appreciative of it. And when I was in Terrace, BC, Canada, so that's northwest, just off the coast, and the lichens and the lungworts, they seem to be more prolific and much larger this year. They were really noticeable. It was amazing to see it.
Wow.
And so yeah, seeing some of the images that you showed today were the same, some of the same lungworts and lichens that I was seeing there. So that was really interesting. And I'll be going to Argyll in early May, and I won't have a lot of time. And I was wondering, in your opinion, around the Kilmartin area, where would be the best spot to go if you had just like one day?
Taynish National Nature Reserve probably be your best bet. Taynish, I think.
Yeah,
Thank you.
if you look up Taynish Woods, then it'll have it there, definitely. And
But
the other place,
you'll see plenty of lungwort just generally because the conditions are so good in parts of Argyll. The tree lungwort is less choosy. The conditions are so wonderful.
Thank you so much. This was brilliant.
We've also, Catherine Higgs just said that they're fabulous photos. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Lucy's got a question about sphagnum as well for picking lichens. So Lucy, do you want to ask it?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I
Yep.
can hear you.
Thank you. No, it's been a great talk. Thank you so much. So you mentioned you were talking about sphagnum at one point, and of course not talking about anything, major, but every now and again I might pick some. And how quickly does it grow again? And then on that, as a sort of follow-up on that, if you mentioned the dyeing of the purple one, I can't remember what it was called, but I believe there's a yellow lichen that you can use for dye. Is that possible?
Mhm.
And does that grow again? I always feel bad sometimes about taking these things just in small
Yeah,
quantities.
I mean, obviously you have to be careful where you're collecting. You need sort of landowner's permission and
Of course.
what have you.
Mhm.
And if it's a triple SI, you need other permissions as well. If you're just taking if you've got those, and if you want sort of say things like sphagnum moss on a sort of small scale, I would maybe target like plantation forestry in the sort of rides and things in the ditches, because that sort of habitat that's going to get trashed at some point when it undergoes clear fell, for instance. And often you get quite a bit of sphagnum in those sort of places. But again, you need the relevant permissions. Yeah, there's various lichens that give you different dyes, and in fact, there's a lichen called crottal lichen, which actually comes from the Gallic crottal, which is, I think, Gallic for lichen, and that particular species is used for like orangey browny colours. But you can get all sorts of different colours out of lichen. There's something called Xanthoria, Xanthoria paritina, which is a very common lichen. It's becoming more common because of atmospheric nitrogen pollution. It's a bright yellow lichen. I think it's like maritime sunburst, like something like that. Anyway, it it gives you a grey dye. It's extraordinary. You'd think it'd be bright yellow or something, but it makes your clothes grey. Anyway, that's whatever you want.
Thank
I hope that gives you an idea.
Thank you.
Annabelle says, brilliant talk, thank you. Do you have any recommendations for someone who wanted to get into lichen ID? Is a high-powered microscope normally required?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'd sort of check out the British Lichen Society website and just sort of get a feel for it. There's lots of like Zoom groups for beginners and improvers, which will be a good sort of starting point. And in those sort of groups, that's where you can ask questions about what sort of microscope would you recommend. So, I mean, as you get more into it, you'd sort of need a stereo microscope, which sort of goes up to like times 40, and that's for sort of it's just amazing to look at lichens at that sort of magnification. But then if you're looking at spores and what have you, you'd need a compound microscope as well, and that's where you get up to like times 400 or times 1,000 magnification, and you need that for spore characteristics. But what I'd say before sort of leaping into this, just there's lots of lichens you can identify without having to use a microscope straight away. So just get a feel for it and make sure you're really into it, and then it's definitely worth the investment.
And Jenny was just suggesting that the FCS has a Lichen ID course starting soon, and she put a link on the chat. So if you want to copy that and put it into your search engine, you should be able to come up with a good one. So thank you for that, Jenny. That was really kind.
Mm.
And I've got Cameron was asking about coppicing. Are you there, Cameron? Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Jacqueline. Great talk, Oliver. Brilliant photos. Your eyesight's obviously an awful lot better for macro photography than mine is. I'm working on the Loch Lomond Oakwoods, and I'm interested in what you said about the coppicing, because if what you said about the impact of coppicing, would that suggest that the old oak tanbark coppice woods will tend to be poorer in the oceanic lichens and bryophytes than other less impacted woods because of this lack of, continuity of the trees?
It's a great question, Cameron. So we ought to first of all appreciate that because of the sort of historic industrial coppicing of oak woods, that they have actually survived to this day. So there's if for instance, if they weren't used as coppiced oak woods back in the day, they might have been given over to grazing, for instance, and we might have lost them entirely. However, you're absolutely spot on. Had a stand of oak wood never been coppiced and survived to this day, then it would have incredible biodiversity. What we're seeing, though, since the tan bark industry and the charcoal industry sort of declined, we're now seeing those sort of remnant stands of old industrial oak woods in the temperate rainforest zone. They all tend to be sort of, you can tell them because they're sort of even-aged trees. They've all grown up and they haven't been cut down since they were last coppiced or planted. So they're sort of 140, 170 years old. And what's actually starting to happen is some of the species, some of the rainforest lichens and bryophytes are starting to come back into those woodlands, starting to colonize those trees. We're looking at 140, 170 years. It takes a while. So those species that I'm talking about would have perhaps somehow survived in refugia, like on mossy rocks of the north. That's where they've survived, and they're only now just starting to come back onto the oaks as they reach a particular age. But had they never been coppiced, those oaks, then the biodiversity would have been amazing. But I also appreciate that by these woods being used, we still have the woods to this day.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's exactly what I wanted to know. Great. Thank you.
Right. I think thank you very much. I know Jenny's put some other links on the page as well. So thank you for that. And lots of praises for your photography as well. But I think we'll make this one the last question. It's from Charlotte Forrest King. Charlotte, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, yes. Thank you for the talk. It's been amazing. I work on lowland heathlands in Staffordshire, on the dry and wet heathland, so slightly different habitat, but you can't help but notice the mosses and the sphagnums all around. It's a subject that I am starting to get into, but you're so enthusiastic when you talk about it. How did you get into it, and is there a certain point for a beginner that you would recommend?
Oh, that's a good question. How did I get into it? I mentioned I spent most of my early childhood and youth in Norfolk, which is a very dry county. Then I went and studied in Aberystwyth, which is complete opposite end of the country, so from the Middle East to the Middle West coast. And then suddenly I realized that moss wasn't just moss, but they were like, what it was, I was sort of in a field trip. I was looking at some moss on a tree, and my lecturer went past and just happened to go blah, 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 some scientific name. I didn't know what it said, but what fascinated me was that moss has names, and it just absolutely gripped me. And so I started getting into mosses and way back decades ago. And when you're looking at mosses and liverworts and things, you can't help but notice lichens as well. And so I mean, then I've just had that interest in me. I've tried teaching myself and what have you with books, and we didn't used to have photo guides back then. But eventually I came to join like the British Biological Society and the British Lichen Society, and you start getting out on field meetings and things, and your learning curve just goes zoom up. And I mean, and then later on I did a doctorate looking at bryophyte lichen ecology and red deer impact and what have you. So I just followed my passion somehow, and it sounds like it's great to hear you've got a similar interest. So try and join a local group, hook up with a come on a field meeting with the BBS once you've become a member or BLS, and maybe I'll see you.
Brilliant. Yes, thank you. And I'll take a look at those guides that have been linked as well. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlotte. We've got just a couple of wee ones. Do you have a social media or like Facebook or X or something where you show what you found when you've been out and about, Oliver, or is it via Plantlife if people wanted to get more information?
So I don't personally, but I do send in my comms people do keep. I'm supposed to send regular pictures in so that they can put it out. So if you look on the Alliance of Scotland's Rainforest sort of comms channels, tweets or X's or whatever they are these days, and also Plantlife as well. Sometimes my pictures get on those sort of channels.
And we've had quite a few people have mentioned Ben Moore as well and their Lichen walk, which is lovely.
Oh, good.
And just from a personal point of view, it was so windy the other week. And when we walked around Monivore, the National Nature Reserve, there was lots on the ground. And if we've done dyeing, and Julie and I have done solar dyeing with lichen before, with groups of children, and I've also done it with adults too. But if you gather the stuff that's on the ground that's fallen off anyway, that's a more sustainable way of using it. So.
It is, but still go easy because I mentioned how I've seen those trees with lungwort just blown off after a storm, and it's like you're standing on like an inch thick layer of tree lungwort. You're probably standing on more lungwort than there is in the whole of Wales or something, and then it gets you thinking because the cyanobacteria component in that particular lichen and others actually fixes atmospheric nitrogen, and then when that breaks down at the base of the tree, that's possibly benefiting the tree. So anyway, just bear that in mind so you don't completely strip the whole what falls down.
No, I wouldn't.
But it's a good idea otherwise.
No, that's great. No, I was taking a group of 3 and 4-year-olds around the Monivore, and they were all being, well, I love the names of lichens. They're so cool names. The old man's beard, they just thought that was wonderful.
And you can have fun as well. Get the children to come up with their own names for them. It's a wonderful exercise.
Yeah, and it's amazing what you can see with just a magnifying glass as well. It's well worth it. It's really good. So. Anyway, I think that's all the question, but there is lots of links there. There's links to some photos as well. So if there's anything that you'd like to copy, have a look. But thank you again, Oliver, and I'm sure everyone else would like to say thank you to you as well. If you want to open up your mics, you can say hello and thank you as well. It'd be great.
Thanks for listening, everyone.